Now it's time for all things mental health with your host, Dr. Nicholas Goodwin. Come on in, take a seat. All are welcome here. It's Health Cafe Radio.
Hello, this is Nicholas Goodwin, Health Cafe Radio, GoodwinHealthCafe.com, here on KSBN, 12:30 a.m. with DJ A-Train on the keys. Salutations, what's up, man?
What up?
What up? That's not mic'd right now because I have another special guest that I'll introduce you in a second. Aaron, what are your thoughts on, I know you don't have a mic, but what are your thoughts on the new Nick Cannon diss tape against Eminem? Have you heard about that?
Yeah, I find this moderately entertaining.
I do it too, yeah.
I will occasionally jump on Yahoo News.
Okay.
For entertainment.
Yeah.
Because like regular news it's still full of crap, but it's not even entertaining.
It's not even interesting anymore.
And so this Eminem thing, like, I was never really too much of a fan of Nick Cannon.
Yeah.
But I'm always for anybody who, if their wife gets talked about, like stands up and says, okay, now we got to meet face to face, bro.
Yeah. Yeah, I
like,
get that.
I dug that aspect of it.
Yeah.
But I would also say this. Nick, don't do a rap battle with Eminem.
Just
fight him, whoop his butt if that's what you want to do.
Physical.
He's going to school you, annihilate you, embarrass you in a rap battle. Like, that's just, come on.
There's no way. And the reason I bring it up is I think it's funny because I was looking at my phone and I knew about it because I was whatever news source I was using, but Fox News popped up and Fox News reported on it and said Nick Cannon defends self and then insinuates Eminem uses crack.
I love that Fox chose the side.
I just thought that was like Fox News got involved, man. I didn't realize it was this national news.
Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, what do you think about Eminem?
What do you guys bring it up? This is my theory on this, and this is honestly, like, as political as I'm going to get, this is kind of my theory on Donald Trump hanging out with Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton saying, yo, we should run against each other, right? I'm thinking like Nick Cannon, Mariah Carey, and Eminem are sitting somewhere in the timeshare they co-own. Nick Cannon's like, man, Eminem, I really wish my rap career could come off. And he's like, dude, just produce something up, let me know, I'll diss you in something, we'll have a back and forth, we'll both make $1 million off of it. That's my theory.
Their agents, at least.
Yeah, their agents like, look, you guys, I know you guys, that's my theory of it. I watched the video of Nick Cannon. Nick Cannon is very talented. He's not a talented rapper. I don't know. And he's not, I mean, honestly though, he doesn't care, because as long as people watch that show, watch him get annihilated, I think he's a millionaire because he pays people to self-depreciate him and make fun of him, and that's how he makes his money.
I'm all for anybody that can laugh at themselves.
Yeah, he can definitely laugh at himself, and I think that works. So that's my perfect transition to my special guest. my beautiful wife, Nicole Goodwin, is here.
Yay.
Hello.
She was here. She was doing a commercial, and she also guest starred on an Aaron's Free Range show. And so we kept her around to do the Health Cafe Radio.
They like me.
That's right. We wanted, and then I also, that way I can have somebody to talk back and forth with when we talk about our topic. And Aaron and recommended that we do themes in December now because of Christmas, and so I was like, well, that's perfect. So I'll talk about suicide. Yikes, that was weird. That's not how I wanted to say that.
That was a little weird.
Yeah. I just thought about today when we're doing the free range show on Christmas, and I was like, man.
Beautiful thing is at this time of year.
Oh wait, don't say it.
Oh,
I don't say it. I wanted to quiz Aaron on that.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
I'll keep my mouth shut.
Because I was like, I'm gonna start talking about some heavy stuff, but that's okay. But Aaron, real quick, one last question, and then I'll let you, and then I'll make it Nicole's thing, because she already knows this. True or false? True or false? Christmas is the time of year. Holiday season is where suicides peak at all-time high. True or false?
True.
That's false. Dang it. I know. That was it. They're false. So maybe it's appropriate because we were able to broach a topic that we're looking at Lowe's right now. We're looking at lows of suicidality, and whereas when does it peak? Do you remember?
It peaks in the spring and summer, the warmer months.
Yeah, it tends to peak.
People have more energy.
More energy and resolve. Nicole was helping me do research last night, so this is perfect. And the reason why this is, if you've been listening to the last couple episodes, or it might be worth going back, because this is transitioning because the last couple times we've been talking about depression and depressive disorders, and I think a lot of people associate depression with suicide. And we talked about it last week and the week before, as a side effect of a lot of the antidepressant medication, which is kind of a strange thought to think of, that the antidepressant medications all have a warning as a side effect that in people 25 years and younger, so adolescents, children, and young adults, it can increase suicidality. And so that's really how we've been talking about it. And I wanted to start talking about it because I want to define what that means, and I want to talk about suicide. Because I think it's really important and really probably the most stigmatized mental health condition or psychiatric disorder is suicide. And what do you think, Nicole?
I agree with that. I think it's important because suicide affects many, many, many people.
Absolutely.
Me personally, there are people who it hasn't, but I would say probably more than not have walked suicide, either personally or tertiary. And it's important to understand suicide and not be afraid of suicide, because it exists and it's devastating. But how can we get behind support and help those who are either dealing with invasive or suicidal thoughts, as well as those who have walked it in their lives?
Definitely. No, I definitely think you're right. A big source for the show as far as content goes is a psychologist named Thomas Joyner. Thomas Joyner he specializes in studying suicide, and so a lot of the information that you're going to hear today is going to be based off of his research. He's written books called Why People Die by Suicide, Suicide Myths, and I didn't read those, but I've read papers that have same information and watched videos based on same information. But one book that I had read, which might be another episode, is called The Perversion of The Perversion of Virtue, where he talks about murder-suicide. And he sort of talks about how murder-suicide is very similar psychologically to suicide. But that's another episode. But in it, he talks a lot about the tenets of suicide. And one thing that he talks about with stigma is he says that stigma is really fear plus ignorance. Stigma is fear plus ignorance.
Absolutely.
Think so?
I think in all aspects.
Yeah.
Suicide, mental health, period.
Everything.
It's unfamiliarity and not understanding. So education is going to be your, I think, top key on that.
Definitely. That's what we learned from Frozen too, right?
Boom, Frozen.
But I don't want to say any more. I don't want to spoil it. But that's right, because they're afraid. Whatever we become afraid of, it leads to stigma. However, his argument is this.
Wars.
What'd you say? What'd you say?
Star Wars.
Star Wars. Oh, yeah. They'll connect, yeah. I liked it. Dude, what was that tune? Go ahead and sing that again. I want to hear that. I don't know if we got copyright, though, Star Wars theme. But his argument here, and you even said this too, you shouldn't be afraid of suicide, but his argument is the ignorance can be resolved, but there probably is a healthy amount of fear necessary for suicide, that it's okay to be afraid of it.
You don't want to see anybody die.
Yeah, you don't want to see anybody die, and that's kind of a big tenet of his. So we're going to do that, but first I have some statistics that I want to break out that I got from NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness. Last week I couldn't remember like a statistic, and I kind of felt embarrassed, and so I wanted to bring them. The correction was I wasn't sure if anxiety is the number one health disorder, like 40%. Of individuals experience some sort of anxiety disorder, and then you have 7%, which is for depressive disorders. Just to correct that, if anybody actually listened to that. So here are some statistics for suicide. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people aged 10 to 34 in the U.S. And a lot of times when we see something like that, Nicole's coming over. Oh, she's to look at it. And I think a lot of times we associate that with, that's really tremendously high. But I think when you have a young population, 10 to 34, there are not a lot of health issues there. So second leading cause, it's still not the highest population of people who commit suicide. Suicide itself is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. This one says, NAMI says the overall suicide rate in the U.S. has increased by 31% since 2001. I'm not sure what studies they looked at to look at that, but that's quite a bit of an increase.
I believe it.
You believe it?
I do.
That has increased in the last 20 years? You think so? 40% of people who die by suicide had a diagnosed mental health condition. What surprises you about that statistic? 40% of people who die by suicide have a diagnosed mental health condition.
It doesn't surprise me.
But
why should it surprise me?
Well, I would think that it would be closer to 100% of people who die by suicide. It's got to be tremendously high. You don't think so? You think 60% of people who kill themselves don't have a mental health condition?
I didn't say that.
Oh, okay. You caught it. Diagnosed, right?
Diagnosed.
Yeah, I think that's shocking. Maybe I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
It's that a lot of people who will die by suicide haven't gotten help. Haven't gotten diagnosed.
When we're talking about mental health, number one, you have to have somebody who actually is seeking help.
Definitely.
To be diagnosed.
Tremendously so.
That's not always a factor.
Right.
Number two is a lot of us, or a lot of people, deal with mental health quietly.
Absolutely.
It's an embarrassing. This is the problem with the stigma, right?
Definitely.
It is embarrassing to have a mental health issue, and it should not be. And so that's where things like the Goodwin Health Cafe or people, we just need to break that having a mental health, I'm going to quotation mark here, issue.
Okay. Yeah.
That is reality.
Definitely.
That is reality.
That's life. Yeah.
And people need to, I guess, get out of their little imaginary glass boxes.
Sure.
Because I think it exists in every person to some extent.
Sure.
Yes, we have chemical deficiencies. That happens.
Yeah.
But I think mental health is afraid to talk about. Definitely. And so we hide it the best we can.
I agree with you. It's very hard to talk about. So here it is. So 90% of people who die by suicide had shown symptoms of a mental health condition, according to interviews with family, friends, and medical professionals, like a psychological autopsy. And so that would be closer to what I would expect, that probably most people had some sort of mental illness, but only less than half actually had treatment or diagnosis. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than straight youth.
Because they don't have a community.
That's really heavy on my heart. Yeah, that's really heavy for me. 75% of people who die by suicide are male. The contrast is they believe women attempt 3 times more often than men, but men tend to be 3/4 of the suicides. Why do you think that is?
Grand overstatement or whatever. When we're talking about wiring and mental wiring and how our brains work and right and left and all of that jazz. I think women have, maybe, this is a grand overstatement, have something that they are caring for potentially.
Sure.
And so there's this idea of I want to do this, I want to follow through, I'm going to follow through, but I have this thing that I'm taking care of.
I gotcha.
Where a man's take care of things looks very different. It's more of a protective or more of a, and so if you have in your idea that people are going to be better off without you, you're not, it's, I guess,
I
don't know
answer.
if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a better answer than what I was going to say. I think what's the common answer to that is that women tend to use less lethal means, but nothing's ever that simple, right? Women do tend to use poisoning, right, overdosing, rather than men who tend to use firearms, which is the most lethal means. But I like your answer because it speaks to really the core condition. A lot of times we want to look at issues like, well, if we just dealt with the firearms, so dealt with, the poison axis, then we would be improving suicide. But you're talking about it from, which we hopefully will spend most of the time in the show about, talking about the actual core issues of suicide here and really what it takes to be able to commit suicide. Potentially, women in as socioeconomic patterns, not with everybody, but in patterns of society, tend to have a lot that they're responsible for, as far as if they have families, etc. They have, even as parents, caretaking for the parents, and so it may be harder for them to get to that end point of resolve where they've then decided to and then are able to take that step.
And that might look different in the future as gender roles
Definitely.
are diffusing.
Yeah.
But right now we're still looking, and so I'm in my 30s.
Yeah.
Still in your 30s, it's starting to break a little bit, but gender roles are still very, very prevalent.
Definitely.
And so that may change in our children's.
Yeah. And my statistic might change.
Yeah.
That's a great answer. I've never heard the answer before. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Transgender adults are 12 times more likely to attempt suicide than the general population. Also breaks my heart. Annual prevalence of serious thoughts by suicide by U.S. demographic group let's see, 4.3% of all adults. So this is serious thoughts of suicide. 4.3% of all adults. 11% of young adults aged 18 to 25. 17% of high school students. And 47.7% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual high school students. And so those are pretty high numbers, anywhere from, especially in high school students, 17% of people have thought about suicide. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual high school students, about 50%. Mm-hmm. And I think that for me, I feel like those numbers are probably higher. You can't talk about something so stigmatized as suicide and say that these numbers are going to be spot on. I think that a lot of people have thought about suicide.
Yes.
I think that a tremendous amount.
So I have a question. I don't know if there's data that can support this. To me, I bet there's not, and so it could be dangerous if we apply too much conjecture.
Yeah.
Having said all that, 17% and 50%.
Yeah.
Both of those percentages are too high.
Too high.
Okay, that's a fifth or half.
Yeah.
These are our kids.
Definitely.
Right? Now, we're all awake to that, hopefully, if we just heard those numbers. My question is, do we believe, is there some proof or data to back up? I shouldn't say forget what we believe. Is there proof or data to back up why the 50% number, why it's so much higher with, is it just social stigma, social pressure, and the things that they face at home?
We find in research that a lack of community, a lack of people bonding together. When people come together, the idea of self-destruction lessens. If we are talking about the transgender, the gay community, even teenagers, period, if they feel alone, if they don't have a community, a support system, they are feeling helpless. And helpless mixed with a number of things which Nick will get into. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me because it's certainly relevant to every other issue that we might talk about, aside even from mental health, right? The idea of how important community is. And so I was just wondering, and thank you for addressing that. I guess, my thought with that, I guess my only follow-up thought to that is, it's difficult enough without community. I think this should answer for some people maybe the reason why certain communities even form.
Yes.
Right? Because they don't feel, it's like I'm going to take my ball and I'm going to go find some other kids I can play with because you won't let me play over here, so to speak. So you've got just the absence of community is a major factor, and that's not even counting people that would actually go out of their way to abuse or hassle people, right? That's just lack of community itself is such a huge factor.
Yeah, yeah.
And something that we'll talk more about it, and I kind of have a theory about this as well, and it even kind of some personal experience, and I kind of can share that too, is I remember I was working with this, a transgender young man, and I was talking to him about what was going on, and he talked about feeling like he was causing a lot of issues at home because of coming out as transgender and wanting to transition, something that he really identified with, and he spent years and years sort of experiencing a lot of stress with. And so I felt like it was really brave of him to be able to identify that, but because of the turmoil that he perceived it created, but I think it did create a lot of stress in his family, it created something that we sort of refer to as burdensomeness, where he felt like he was a burden to his family, and in some cases it may have been true. It may, even though even if the family had intended to do everything right, it can be a hard thing for them, and so there could have been a burdensomeness there, or likely was a burdensomeness, but he felt that. And really, what we'll talk about is burdensomeness, even if it's perceived or actual burdensomeness, is like one of the three biggest risk factors for suiciding. That burdensomeness. And the other, and I'll just talk about them now, the other one is, the technical term is thwarted belongingness, but it really is loneliness. Or aloneness. Betterness would be aloneness, right? You're not lonely, you're actually alone. And which can also which is what we talked about, that lack of community there that these individuals can experience, teenagers in general, people in general, but especially the LGBTQ community. But that will feed off of, right, if my community is my family, and now I'm all of a sudden this huge burden to them, that's going to then circle around and cause that aloneness, right? Which become, that's the ingredients really to suicidal thoughts, is those two things. There's an extra step that has to exist in order for suicide behavior to occur, but we'll talk about that more as we go. And so with that, I want to spend some time defining a couple terms, because something that sometimes we struggle with, especially we talked about this last time, is that when you had that side effect with the antidepressant, we talked about it increases suicidality. What is suicidality? What does that term mean? It's really an umbrella term to refer to a lot of different phenomenons that are all similar in some way, but it's talking about anything that consists of somebody harming themselves or killing themselves or having a desire to harm or kill themselves. And so different terms would be, one of them is, so suicide itself. A lot of times when you're talking about somebody who committed suicide, you can say committed suicide. You can say suicide decedent. You could say suicided, the individual suicided. One thing that I'd be careful not to say is succeeded. I try not to say that the suicide was successful. That's the wrong term. It puts kind of a positive light on that. Or if they attempted suicide and didn't die, that's not considered a suicide failure, right? Those definitions don't match, and it's stigmatizing. Suicide. They're also suicidal ideation. So when someone has suicidal ideation is when they have thoughts of suicide in some capacity, and that can be broken down into two other terms. One is active suicidality or active suicidal ideation, where the thoughts about killing themselves can be very specific, and then their desire to die is very real, right? Their desire to take their own life has become very real for them. And then you have passive suicidality or passive suicidal ideation, and the passive suicidal ideation talks more about not wanting to be alive anymore, right? Or wishing that they were dead, or wishing that they would go to sleep and never wake up. Those are sort of languages that you'll hear. Those are sort of phrases that you can hear from somebody who has passive suicidality. I just don't want to be on this world anymore. My time has come and it's past. Those kind of words. And then the final term is non-suicidal self-injurious behavior, which refers to an action that is taken to hurt one person is to hurt themselves. And there's a big distinction, as this behavior, this action is not intended to be suicidal. It's not intended to kill the person. It's not a suicide attempt. It's done for other reasons. And this can include things like cutting. People tend to cut on their arms, or they'll cut on their upper thighs. This can be burning them. This can also be ingesting certain items. This can be head banging or punching walls. And it's really just self-defined by whatever the person says it is, and that it's just that is that whatever it is that the person will do to self-harm. And we might after the break we might spend some time breaking down maybe why people self-harm, and in order for them to why that occurs, and why people do that. But we'll go ahead and lean into a break, and we'll talk to you guys in a little bit.
Hey Spokane, this is Nicole with A Time to Dance. Do you love dance? Or maybe you've dreamed about exploring the art of movement. Come visit us at A Time to Dance in the Garland District at the corner of Garland and Post. Explore the freedom that dance can bring. We offer high-end education, experienced instructors. Visit us on Facebook at A Time to Dance or call 509-995-5207. Now for details. That's 995-5207. Come join us on the dance floor.
Hi everyone, this is Dr. Steve Crosby here at Stephanos Ministries. If you stepped away from church or Christian life or faith in general, we at Stephanos Ministries have materials that could be helpful to you in navigating your questions about prayer, worship, church, scripture, but most importantly, your relationship with Jesus and with one another and the world. We have stevecrosby.org is the blog. Brothers in a Basement is our podcast with my friend Brian Wiebold, and stephencrosby.soarlms.com, stephencrosby.soarlms.com. stephencrosby.storelms.com. Video and audio resources there for you, and some of them are free. So if you're facing challenges in Christian life, just like the rest of us, don't walk away from Jesus. Walk toward your Father. Thanks for listening.
All right, welcome back. Health Cafe Radio, KSBN, 1230 a.m. I'm here with my lovely wife, Nicole Goodwin.
Hello.
And we're talking about some heavy topic of suicidality, defining the terms. Before the break, we talked about some statistics that probably over a series of a couple shows we'll get more into specifically. And then we also defined some terms as far as what kind of goes underneath suicidality, as far as suicidal ideation, which is the thought of suicide, a suicide attempt, which is when an effort is made to take one's own life, a suicide completion when somebody dies by suicide, and also non-suicidal self-injurious behavior, which is when somebody hurts themselves without the intention to die. We talked a little bit earlier as well about what are some of the big risk factors for suicide, and there's lots of them. There's hundreds of them of risk factors for suicide, but specifically Thomas Joyner, who I referenced as a big source for this information, discusses three big risk factors that need to exist in order for somebody to take their life by suicide. And we talked about two of them already. First one is burdensomeness, and that's the perceived or actual burdensomeness, the idea that you are a burden to other people.
People
and
would
that
be better off without us here.
Exactly, and that they would be better off if you were no longer alive, right? The second one is the thwarted belongingness, or the aloneness, or the loneliness, right? The idea that you're all alone in this world, that there's nobody for you, and again, that can be perceived or actual. I've definitely interacted with some people that are absolutely alone, and that can be very scary as far as risk goes. And the third thing, which I'll just mention and then we'll talk about a little later, is something that's referred to as is really just the ability to take your own life. It's just that third thing is just the actual physical capacity to take your own life, which is
Fearlessness.
Fearlessness, right? It's not necessarily bravery, right? It's not the right word. And so fearlessness is kind of the best word, because the fact that we're so ingrained not to do something like that it takes absolute fearlessness to do that. And if you look at people who've taken their own lives or have attempted, that fearlessness is continued to be met fiercely with physical objection, right? Even the body will object to it, even if the person's trying to attempt, right? There's like these safeguards there. And what we've also noticed is that when people who've survived suicide attempts, when they referenced it, is that they made a decision to kill themselves, they attempted, and in between attempting and then continuing to be alive, after they sort of took, sometimes for people who jumped off a bridge, they immediately regretted it after 2 seconds. And so that fearlessness, even in those people who die by suicide, likely still kicks in at the last minute.
Yes, they have to be in a very focused.
Yeah.
I'm not hijacking you here, am I?
No, you're good.
You have to be. There is a focusedness that happens, and the term that the psychologist used, was, if you blink, you cannot follow through.
Okay, yeah.
And it's this idea that you have set your mind on something so hard, and that you have decided, determined, probably rehearsed it 5 million times in your head.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden you are there. And the reason why a gun is most likely one of the most lethal is because it takes a second to pull the trigger, and there's no coming back.
There's no in-between zone there.
You jump off a bridge, there's a grab.
Yeah, yeah.
You sit in front of the train, there's a duck.
Yeah, yeah.
You decide, you put the drink down.
Right. Or you call the police after you poison yourself.
Right. There is the very, it is ingrained in us. It is ingrained in every mammal, every animal to survive, right? Mankind is on this earth because we have survived.
Yeah. Well, there's an example of that too, and I can't do it on a radio show, but there's an Israeli woman. who went to the psychiatric hospital for 9 days and for suicidal ideation that she was going to jump in front of a train. And she recovered. Her suicidality improved considerably, but after she was discharged, it returned. And there's a video, you can look it up, and she doesn't die in it. She doesn't get hurt at all. So it's, but it's still, I mean, it's pretty upsetting to watch, but she sat in front of a train. And what she did is she went to the train tracks, and actually local people who were parked next to it were trying to get her to stop. But she kneeled down on the train track, and when you kneel down, your eyes go to the floor, and then they come up. And she comes up, and her body immediately flattens to the ground as the train comes over her, like a second before the train comes over her. And the train is long, and she stays underneath the train the whole time, and she doesn't get hurt at all. But that was, you see that body response trigger for her, where it's saved her life. But you can look that up on YouTube.
There comes the extreme desperation to be able to overcome what is already ingrained in your body.
Yeah.
And so when we are talking about people, young people, old people, middle-aged people, it doesn't matter. When we're talking about human beings, at the point to where they are going to commit suicide, we have to understand that they're not doing it out of selfishness, though it feels selfish. We are looking at someone who is so desperate,
right,
that they have worked so hard to overcome everything their mind and body tells them opposed to. And find a human in that state of mind is devastating. Definitely. And so that's why when there's a stigma, when there's this thing, when there's a selfishness, when there's oh, you're a brat, or you're trying to manipulate your situation.
Yeah.
Can that all occur? Sure, that can all occur. But you have to realize that somebody who's in that mindset is in a very desperate place in their life.
Definitely. And that is not something that, it's something that it takes a long time. It takes a lot of resolve. It's not something that's impulsive. Which we'll talk about a little bit, because that's a big stigma. That's a kind of a myth of suicide, is that it's an impulsive action. But it's not quite. But I do want to talk about something, which kind of brings us back to the season. I want to tell a couple of interesting facts here. In September 10th, kind of the national average for suiciding is 90 to 100, and that's kind of a high average. So on September 10th, 2001, or September 9th, 2001, 92 people took their lives. In September 11th, 2001, no, September 10th, 2001, 98 people took their lives. On September 11th, 2001, 32 people, 30-some people took their lives.
36,
an incredible low, right? Usually it's not below 60, which is the lowest it's ever been in American history. So on September 11th, during those attacks, America experienced the lowest suicide rate it's ever experienced. And I think that speaks to that community element that we talked about a little earlier, right? The same thing that I think is why Christmas and the holiday seasons, why suicide rates dip, is because of that family and that community element.
There's a coming together.
There's a coming
even
together.
Most.
Yeah. And that's not just for suicide either. That's for a lot of mental illness, a lot of mental conditions, right? Suicide risks increase considerably as there's more mental illness sort of exists, and people who commit suicide a lot of times have several co-occurring mental health and substance abuse issues. And so we know that community isn't just good for the suicide, it's also good for all mental health issues, and that it can be very, very protective for individuals. So Nicole, I have a question for you. In what different communities do you see local to us that do you think would be helpful for people in who are having mental health issues?
Elaborate.
I'm thinking of, because we're wanting to help people, and there's so much to unwrap here. I think I'll spend several episodes on this. But what do you see in Spokane where people can find that community? Maybe they don't have it in family, or maybe they don't feel it exists in family. What are people doing? Well, I was trying to plug your like a time to dance a little bit.
Okay,
I feel like we can give ourselves credit for what we do. You know what I mean? I don't think we have to come up with a magic thing, but I think that sometimes we have to give ourselves credit for what is there. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us, and that's right around us. And so we just listen to a time to dance commercial.
Yeah. Well, like yes, a time to dance. Come join us. Be a community dance. But another thing is, if it is something that you struggle with, or a family member of you struggles with, help them find a community outside of yourself.
Definitely.
Right? Because, I mean, everything is hard, but help them find something they can really pour themselves into something that brings them internal freedom.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, dance has always been an outlet for me in my struggles, in my hurt, in my youth, in my adulthood. When everything's laying flat on the floor, I know I can show up to dance, and it's not about who I am, what I look like, and what I can accomplish. It's I am there with other people who are just going to dance and are looking for that internal freedom. There are some great communities in Spokane, too, that sports communities, church communities, so many different communities. Find your outlet. Help a young person, whether you agree with them or not.
Definitely.
Help them find that outlet that helps them tick, be it art, be it poetry, be it movies, be it whatever. Help somebody find a community. Yeah, absolutely.
And really what I see when you're talking about, because it's, you know, social interactions can be really hard and relationships can be really hard. And I think a lot of times we have this expectation that, you know, like, okay, well, if I'm going to invite you to everything.
School's not the community.
School's not the community?
No. So there's so many different factors in school.
I'm not talking about school.
I know. I'm just saying. I'm just like putting that out there. Find a tertiary support.
Secondary
Don't just say like, oh, my kid's in school all day long.
Yeah,
they should be good.
Right,
they got friends.
They talk to people.
Nah, they need something where
something that they can buy
into.
Yeah. And I think that you know, a lot of times in relationships you have this you know, okay, well, I invite them to everything. They don't invite me to everything, so clearly they don't care about a relationship. And so there's a lot of stake in relationships, a lot of stake in community sometimes. You can make a lot of hurt there as well. But I think in something that I see differently in the holiday, where I see maybe there's more of an internal struggle for this with people in the holidays, is how do I give without expecting a return? Or how do I give of myself in kind of a selfless, and how do I make this about somebody else and not about myself, right? And I think when when people get really hurt and people get really sick, it's so strong and it's such a powerful experience. Not powerful, but it's such a hardcore experience that it's very difficult to see anything outside of that, right? It's very easy to live in that pain, and that pain becomes everything, and it becomes all-consuming. But sometimes when we're sort of forced to, if it's by just the holidays or even obligation, where we sort of have to step out of it for a second, then that pain can become less. It can become diminished if it's not about me and what it is about me. And I'm not saying that people are selfish. This is not selfishness. This is about survival. But when it doesn't become about yourself and it can become about other people, right? Then we can kind of live for those other relationships. And that's really where I see that healthiness come from, is when you can kind of give something. And I think it becomes very fulfilling because you're like, wow, I actually made a difference there, or I contributed in some way. So finding that contributable community, right? Right, because in your dance studio, you're able to teach people how to dance, and you're able to give that to them, and that can be very fulfilling, even though it can be a lot of hard work and be very emotionally exhausting sometimes, right? But being able to find that thing, that way to contribute, I think is a big key here, as far as feeling better, and building those strengths and resiliences.
Yeah, I think it's very important for every human being, and that's why I say a community that makes you tick. What can you give? Because the moment that our focus is no longer on ourselves, we see that we are in and contributing to something, right? The more I think about, oh, I'm not doing this, oh, I'm not doing that, I just get buried and buried under this dark and daunting feeling. And the more I can think of, right, for me personally, like my kids or the studio or other people that we work with or that I work with, the more that my focus is outward.
Yeah.
Which when we're sunken in a ditch, sometimes that's really hard to see.
Definitely.
And so sometimes we need help finding that space.
Yeah.
Right? That little root that's sticking out that I can grab onto so I can start crawling my way up. Sometimes when we feel sunken and lost, we do feel that loneliness, that we are alone. There's nothing for me.
Definitely.
And so finding in the Christmas season, in every season, finding that place and helping those loved ones of yours find that place, because you can't be that person's only person.
Yeah.
Right? Find that place where they can contribute, right? So young people, like we're looking at high rates of young people, what can they contribute? But they're not financially stable. They're not blah 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 ha ha. What can they contribute? And sometimes it's an idea, but they have to have that place, right?
Yeah,
slam poetry, baby. Bring the slam poetry. They can contribute their words, and their words can affect someone else.
Right.
When that fear, and so thinking outside that box. But that community is, I think, not that community. That idea that we are focusing and helping someone else. Right? There's that beautiful saying that my struggles will be someone else's freedom.
Oh, yeah.
And so being able to take and own what you struggle with, not being afraid of it, not being stigmatized. Okay, I have these thoughts. I have this desperation. How can I give that to someone else? How can I support someone else through these same feelings?
Yeah, that's good.
You know?
Something that I hear a lot, and I don't know if I disagree with it. Part of me does, but what I hear people say a lot is how can I help somebody unless I help myself first, right? And sometimes when people who feel like they're in a position, a lot of times it's parenting or it's they're in a supportive relationship. It's like, well, I'm not in a place right now where I can contribute this because I need to help myself first. And I can intellectually kind of understand that.
We're very individualistic society.
But I'm worried that I'm worried that if you're only if that focus is on yourself, not saying that people don't, shouldn't wear themselves out, but I'm afraid that they'll just keep on getting stuck in it. You know what I mean?
You absolutely dig a bigger ditch. You're digging yourself a ditch because when we are focused on ourselves, we are focused on all that is wrong in ourselves.
Yeah.
Where it is hard to find what is right in ourselves.
Definitely.
And so, not that you have to go and become somebody else's counselor. That's not what we're saying.
Right.
It's this idea that your focus is on someone else, because through someone else, you may just find that healing that has been needed for you all along.
Yeah.
And not that things are going to get better right away or easier, but when our focus is in helping, enjoying, and loving on other people, it helps lift a load.
Yeah.
Helps lift a load.
Aaron, have you ever heard that before? Someone says that where they say like, I can't help somebody until I help myself.
Yeah, I mean, I run into that all the time. I was actually, unfortunately, with the line of work I've been in for the last half decade, a lot of this stuff goes back to relating to kids that are being traumatized and how we're going to help them. And one of the probably biggest frustrations for me personally in my life as a man is that as a community, as a society, people that I've worked with in the anti-trafficking industry, but as a greater community, we're still expecting women and children to go rescue and save and care for women and children. Like, I see dudes constantly, and these are guys that we would consider contributing members of society, good dads, good husbands, they're not what we would consider, bad person that belongs in jail or whatever, a contributing member of society. And as men, frequently, we can get fired up to put a jersey with someone else's name on our back. We can paint our faces in 4 or 7 different colors, and all of that kind of stuff. And when it comes to caring about the 12-year-old that was just literally stolen from down the street, our response as men is, I got my family to take care of. It breaks my heart.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Dealing with trafficking, this is a little bit of a side rabbit trail here.
Which is that idea that we've got to take. I'm not saying that some of those guys probably don't. Maybe they wonder if they would be equipped to, say, go out on a reload with Nick or something. And maybe they wouldn't. Maybe that's not their thing. But I think it's just getting motivated to be engaged in certain things at all. And I don't want to take it to the trafficking tip, but I think you hit on something. Part of that maybe is insecurity. Mm-hmm. So without just bashing guys, I don't know how we overcome that, but I see that frequently, and whether it's just purely fear or purely selfishness or survival, I don't know. But as a guy, I see it a lot, and it's disturbing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are the averages in American suicide versus other countries?
What are the averages?
Do you know?
I'm not sure. I think. What are you thinking about taking this? Are you thinking about
Well, it's again that idea of we are an individualistic society.
Yeah.
And therefore, our thoughts are very self-focused. And when we have somebody in our lives who commits suicide, they're doing that to us. When they're not. And then also, I am alone. I have nobody for me. What I was going to say earlier in relation to community, we have these wonderful girls that we take care of. And the beautiful thing was they were both living very, very hard, isolated lives. And they came together, and instead of being focused, the older one tried to start helping that younger one. And you saw this girl all of a sudden realize that, like, oh, my stuff. I'm not the only one dealing with stuff. How can I help this young person who was only a year or two younger? How can I help this young person? And we saw healing through that. And we're dealing with people who don't want to live anymore, whether or not they have that final stage where they could fulfill the taking of their lives. It was this idea that all of a sudden, I have someone that I'm not thinking of myself anymore.
Yeah.
I see that.
Yeah, Aaron handed me a map, and you can look it up with what countries. I'm not saying you can just look it up, but I mean, like, people listening, they can look it up with. And I think that kind of looking at it, it seems like it doesn't play out. It doesn't play out like you think it would. America's pretty high. I think people in the Caribbean islands was like the lowest area. But my hypothesis would be like collectivistic cultures would that would be a protective factor versus individualistic cultures. But I think I've looked into that a little bit with mental health issues, and I haven't seen. I think a lot of people have too, that collectivistic societies tend to also have different issues that they tend to be a little bit different, but they still tend to have some.
Yes.
But I would think that would be very protective, right? Because that collectivistic idea is that I'm not the priority in this environment, that the family as a whole is the priority.
Yeah.
So
as we start closing up, you brought up yesterday that to not be afraid to ask someone, and also not be afraid when you hear someone say, I don't want to exist.
Yeah.
To not say, well, you can't say those things.
Yeah. To
not ignore them. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you brought up yesterday.
Yeah, and I think maybe we'll spend more time on this how to. But I do want to spend the rest of this being very practical, and then tune in next time, and I'll spend a lot of time on this. But 70% of people who committed suicide talked about it, right? 70% of people said that they were going to do it, which is incredibly high. And so I think sometimes there's the idea that if I ask somebody about suicide, that I'm going to give them the idea. That if I say, hey, have you ever been thinking about suicide? That they say, well, no, I haven't, but I am now. That's not something that exists, right? Because what we know about suicide and the psychology that goes behind it is that it's very, the person's thought about it a lot. They thought about it a lot. And so not being afraid to ask, and I teach nursing students how to ask this question, and it's hard to ask initially. It's hard to ask for the first time. But what we know is that people who are thinking about suicide are likely to answer yes if they're asked directly, right? If you ask them, and you can try to do it in I try to do it in a minimalizing way, in an empathetic way. I try to have a soft voice, and I try to say something like, you said something earlier about not wanting to be alive anymore, and that made me concerned. Are you having any thoughts that you want to kill yourself, right? And then I try to keep a really open posture towards them. I try to make eye contact, and I just wait for an answer, right? I don't tell them why. I just sort of sit there and wait for them to answer that, and it gives them an opportunity to say yes, right? I'm asking them directly, I'm asking them non-judgmentally, and then I'm giving them the space to say yes, right? A lot of healthcare providers make the mistake of when they're charting, is their backs turned to the patient and they say, you're not feeling suicidal, are you? Right? They're not giving them permission to say yes, right? So as a healthcare professional, I try to do that.
And I won't take a ton of time with this, but I some personal experience with this, my dealing with my mom and some other issues from my youth, and so one of the things that I guess I just wanted to, there's a ton of stuff that Nicole was saying that I kind of want to react to, but one of the things that you just touched on that I just felt like, I want to personally put this on the air right now as a 43-year-old man who I'm as broken as anybody else, but there's food on my table. My kids go to school. You know what I mean? I don't put my hands on my wife. There's nothing that that maybe would look like, oh, stuff's burning down right now in this guy's life from the outside. But I will just say, and this is prior to my life of faith, and and has become more present. It exists now more presently in my mind because I understand more, having walked through a life of faith. But the number of times where I have something that is just under my skin, it is almost on the surface, and I'm literally just anybody who, if I could trust them even a bit, would ask me about it. They'd get the whole story. But there's something that happens to us as human beings, and you would know more about this process than me. I'm still asking myself why that is. Like, why am I not more proactive about that conversation? What is it about me? And I don't know if it's just that idea that, well, if somebody asks me about it, then that proves that they care, and then it's safe to share. I don't know what the deal is, but there are issue after issue I think of in my life. And it's not necessarily always suicidality or something like that. I mean, it could be other things where it's like, man, when my mom passed away, I went a year before I finally said, you know, I wish someone would ask me how I'm doing. If somebody would have asked me in that first year, I would have absolutely shared with them. But it took me a year to be able to vocalize to someone else, I need you to ask me. And I don't know what that's all about, but I just figured I'd share that because I figure if I deal with that, there's got to be other people that do as well.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that, man, because I think that's true about a lot of things. I think it's, it's that initial step to ask can be really hard. And we don't really empower ourselves to talk about our feelings with people, and it can be really hard to trust the right person. And so, I think this message is out to people who you have people in your life you're not sure about. It's just encouraging you to reach out. And what I've noticed is the fear is that, well, I don't want to ask people if they're going to commit suicide because I'm afraid they're going to say yes, right? What do you do with that yes? What do you do when they say, no, I've thought about it a lot. I've thought about it a lot, and I've thought about it for years. How do you respond to that? And that's very scary. I think it's very scary, and I think that's a big barrier there. And I think that maybe, this is a great place for this conversation to go, because I think that's maybe where we'll spend, maybe we'll do, this episode part 2 where we'll really talk about how do you identify that risk? How do you see that risk in people? How do you identify the chronic long-term issue? And how do you identify the change in behavior that may predispose some sort of suicidal gesture, behavior, attempt? And then how do you talk to somebody about it? I'm a healthcare professional, but how do you talk to somebody as somebody who's as a family member, or as a spouse, or as a parent?
In our area, we got kids dropping like flies out here.
Yeah.
Right? And to be able to empower some of these parents or other people to engage that would be awesome.
And what if they say yes? How do you respond to it when someone says yes? Yeah. And so I really would like to spend that the next time doing that. So that's probably what we'll do. So but I want to go ahead and say thanks to Nicole for coming out.
Thank you.
And doing research with me yesterday about it. And I want to say thanks to DJ Aaron for mixing them bad tunes. And hopefully you guys tune in next week. Like I said, we'll spend time on it. We'll give you guys some really practical information, and we'll really break this down to help you out next time. So this is Nicholas Goodwin on Health Cafe Radio, 12:30 a.m. We'll catch you next week, Saturday at 6:05 p.m.